We now move on to the material cause of the Protestant Reformation, the doctrine of sola fide, salvation by faith alone. And as much as Roman Catholics or Eastern Orthodox Christians would like to suggest that this doctrine has no historical basis in the early church, we can see from writings such as Polycarp's letter to the Philippians and others that this claim, like the claim that unconditional election wasn't taught in the early church, is indeed a little outlandish, because the concepts of sola fide, if not outright taught, definitely do exist in seed form in the early church fathers, and we are going to demonstrate that here in Polycarp's letter to the Philippians. We'll return once again to chapter 1, verse 3, a verse that we've already examined, where we find Polycarp, as I previously mentioned, undoubtedly quoting Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9, in an effort to articulate his view of soteriology, that is, the doctrine of salvation. God's elect are not saved by their own works, but rather by the grace of God presented through his own will in Jesus Christ. This articulation implies sola fide, because if works are not the instrument by which a person accesses the grace of God, then that leaves faith as the sole instrumental cause by which a person receives God's grace. This concept is more precisely laid out in the language of the Apostle Paul in Ephesians chapter 2, and this is, of course, because Polycarp is quoting that, likely, this is consistent with all the historical Protestant understandings of how one is justified before God. Now, objections to this understanding of Polycarp's soteriology can and have been made by those who reject sola fide. One such objection is found in the very next chapter, in chapter 2, verse 2, where Polycarp states that God will raise us if we do his will and follow in his commandments and love the things he loved. This language, it is argued, certainly seems to suggest that our salvation is truly dependent upon our own works and obedience to God's commandments. But remember, in the preceding chapter, Polycarp already explained that salvation is not rendered to a person on the basis of works. So any interpretation that suggests works are the basis for one's salvation is an incorrect interpretation. And as I've pointed out in my first video on Ignatius, exhorting Christians to obey God's commands and to do good works is not a defeater of sola fide, because if a Christian has genuine faith, then they will necessarily perform good works. But that does not mean the works themselves procure one's justification before God. Thus, Protestants have no problem accepting that Polycarp teaches Christians will be raised up only if they follow God's will and commandments, since a regenerate Christian with a genuine faith will naturally do just that. At best, those who reject sola fide could suggest that Polycarp is merely referring to initial salvation when stating that we are saved by grace and not by works, but that our final salvation is dependent upon our obedience to God's commandments. However, this is a distinction that must be derived from the text, which I, of course, do not believe can be done. Those who reject sola fide must demonstrate that when Polycarp states we have not been saved by works, he is only referring to the act of initial salvation alone and not final salvation. Again, I don't believe this can be substantiated, not only in Polycarp's letter, but the scriptures themselves as well, as Polycarp appears to talk about salvation in a general sense, the fact that the entirety of our salvation is dependent solely upon grace, which therefore means the entirety of our salvation is not dependent upon works. A second objection is also often raised in Polycarp's letter to the Philippians chapter 5 verse 2, which says the following: "If we please him in this present age, we will receive also that which is to come, just as he promised us to raise us from the dead, and that if we conduct our lives in a manner worthy of him, we will also reign with him, if indeed we have faith." So once again, you get the language toward the back half of this verse that we will be raised up and reign with Christ only if we conduct our lives in a manner worthy of him, suggesting that works play a part of our justification before God. Again, I would appeal to the language and the description of the Protestant understanding of salvation that I articulated in the previous objection, that simply exhorting Christians to do good works is not a defeater of sola fide, because a person who has a genuine faith in Christ will do good works. They will conduct their lives in a manner worthy of Christ, but that does not mean the works themselves play a justifying role in the way that faith does, specifically holding on to the righteousness of Christ, which specifically justifies us. But as a second point, I would just point to the last 5 words of this verse to conclude my contention that sola fide is the proper understanding of Polycarp's message here, and that is, we will be raised up and conduct our lives in a manner worthy of him if indeed we have faith. Yes, we will reign with Christ, we will conduct our lives in a manner worthy of Christ, we will live the Christian life and obey God's will and commandments only if we have faith. And if we have faith, we can be assured that we will necessarily do those things, because God is the one who works in us to will and to act in order to fulfill his good pleasure. But once again, none of the language that Polycarp articulates here suggests that the works play a justifying role in salvation in the same way that faith does. As many Protestants before me have articulated, faith alone saves, but saving faith is never alone.